Today I've got the guitar, and when I say the guitar, this is the guitar that I wanted when I bought that Flying V many moons ago. The Flying V was actually kind of a settle for because I didn't have one of these. Well, what is this? If you've never seen one before, this is a Gibson Explorer, and it's a Gibson Explorer in a kind of an uncommon color these days, which is natural mahogany. These were kind of popular when I say popular, I mean at the height of their popularity in the 70s or so. And you know, this particular color, well, once the 80s hit, as my sales guy at the guitar store likes to tell me sometimes, once the 80s came around, you couldn't give away guitars in a natural wood color. Everybody wanted these solid, bright colors like that yellow BC Rich that you might have seen in one of my other videos. That was all the rage in the 80s, where you had to have these neon, kind of very bright and loud in-your-face kind of colors. So, what is this? It's a 2006 Gibson X Factor, which is a name that they gave for a year or two to what are basically the Explorers. I don't know why they changed the name. The guitar really didn't change significantly. It's not like a Les Paul where you can carve out sections of the body hidden underneath the top, because basically this is a flat slab of mahogany. There's not a separate cap that goes on that can hide things. There's not a lot of opportunity there to really hide the fact that you'd be carving a lot of this stuff out. So this is basically a solid chunk of mahogany. It's got some fair amount of weight to it, but the thing that really shocked me when I bought this guitar is how well balanced it is. So let's get into the design of it a little bit. It's a 6-in-line headstock, which is somewhat reminiscent of a Fender, but unlike a Fender, if you look at it from this angle, what you'll hopefully be able to tell is that the neck is pitched back a little bit. Gibson likes to do that because what it does is it puts string pressure on the nut to hold the strings tighter against that nut to give the string a definite end point. It makes them a lot less likely to pop out or things like that without putting our artificial things in like string trees. Unfortunately, because they design these headstocks a little bit aesthetically, sometimes the strings have to go through contortions once they go through the nut, which makes them a little bit more prone to things like binding when you're doing bends. What that means is that if you bend the string up, it's going to pull the string a little bit through the nut, and when you release it, it may not go exactly back to where it started. It may kind of hang up in that nut because it's going through it at kind of a funny angle. That can sometimes lead to some tuning problems. I generally, you know, it's not that I haven't seen it, but generally I don't see it that bad. Especially with my playing style, where what I like to call turn up the volume and beat the crap out of the strings. That tends to kind of resettle the strings where they need to be once I've gotten you know, the balance you know, just right on the tuning and things like that. So where did this guitar originate? Well, in the late 1950s, with the space age going on, Gibson was kind of in a position where they were viewed as this old maker of like classic archtop guitars that you would use for things like jazz, banjos, mandolins, and really just what was considered at the time to be old fogey instruments. These days they're looked at as kind of, you know, a lot of younger musicians are using those types of instruments because it, you know, of the style of music has kind of changed a little bit. But they had this self-perception at the time under President Ted McCarty in the 50s and early 60s that they had kind of grown this stodgy kind of an image, and companies like Fender were taking business away from them by seeming to be younger and more hip and more accessible. So what they did is Ted McCarty at the time came up with these designs that were a lot more angular than what you would have considered a guitar in the past, and because it was a solid body guitar, it really wasn't going to affect its ability to put out a decent sound over an amplifier. So they went with these very kind of angular shapes. They called these the Designer Series, with straight lines, swept back tail fins like you might see on an old Chevy, because that was kind of copying the cars, which were in turn copying the jet airplanes and the rockets and things like that. that were kind of viewed as cutting edge and high tech back then. So in 1957, the patents were filed for 3 guitars: the Explorer, the Flying V, and the Moderne. A little more on that in a future video. But they produced a couple of these things, and they used this old wood called Carina to kind of give them a bit of a gimmick, so they weren't made out of the same old mahogany as everything else. And what turned out happening is the public wasn't ready for these guitars. They were just way too out there. They didn't even look like instruments. And people were much more conservative back then. So what happened is the first couple of years, 1957, 58, I think into 59, they might have sold a grand total of 50 of these things. Maybe. People just weren't ready for it. It was too out there. But they're great guitars. They're highly sought after by collectors these days, and they will cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to find an original example. Well, after a couple of years, they decided, you know what, these things aren't selling. We need to try something else. That's when things like, the Les Paul model got retired because it was viewed as being a little bit too old-fashioned, and they wanted something newer and lighter and a little bit sleeker and sharper to take its place, and that's where the SG got introduced. Fast forward to about 1976 or so, and a lot of the musicians of the late 60s and early 70s, well, they were basically picking up a lot of these original instruments, things like Explorers, but more so Les Pauls, as used instruments on the used market. They weren't worth anything. People didn't collect this stuff back then. It was just an old, beat-up, used guitar. So what started happening is you started having some musicians getting their hands on the few of these that made their way out into the market, and actually performing with them. They found that they liked them. By 1976, just prior to 1976, a company called Hamer came along that really liked this design as well, and they started making them on their own independently because it was a neat design. Well, Gibson saw these selling and decided, hey, we need to reissue this. So in 1976, they reissued the Explorer, and the original reissue was kind of in a natural color like this with metal gold-plated pickups on top of it, and I don't know what kind of tuners they were using back then, but it was basically kind of a throwback to the old Explorer shape, but they decided to use what they had readily available at the time, which was mahogany, not Carina wood. So it got reissued as a mahogany guitar. If you watch old video clips of bands like Heart, there's a few others, but they're the ones that stick out with that Barracuda video. Playing in the 70s, they've got guitars like this because it was, even though it was a reissue or a really old model, at that time it was kind of cutting edge, and that was kind of the equivalent to what people today would view things like modern Schechters or Deans or ESPs, although those are, with the exception of the ESPs, they're usually, the Schechters and the Deans are a little bit lower of a tier. But there really weren't a pickups behave, despite me lowering them quite a bit. So next I'm on the clean setting, which is not quite acoustic. It's more of a clean electric kind of a sound. And going on to a classic sound. And lastly, this is the heavy sound. This guitar kind of excels at these last two. The clean sounds decent, but you add a little bit of gain to this guitar and it just really shines. So I don't play this guitar as much as I used to anymore, not because there's anything wrong with this guitar, but because by the time I bought this guitar I was kind of bitten by the bug. I was already kind of starting to look at guitars and amplifiers and things like that in kind of a different way by that point. Whereas when I bought the Flying V, my mentality was, you know what, once in my life I should buy something this nice for myself. Once I got through the financial kind of fallout of doing that, I kind of started to look at these things, and I was in a band at the time in kind of a light of, this is great, I want to try more, I want to try different ones, wow, that looks kind of neat, wow, that looks kind of neat. And that's kind of the mentality that I took. So, you know, this was kind of early on in my road to trying out different kinds of gear. And it was a great guitar, but it left me wanting even more. So the reason I don't play this one very much these days is despite its awesome balance and its easy playability, I ended up trying out other guitars and other amplifiers and finding things that I thought sounded slightly better or significantly better and had different playing characteristics to them. So this was just a, you know, even though this was the guitar at the time, it was just a step along the way on the journey. And it's a journey that you know, I like to think I've completed, but every once in a while I still see something that makes me go, oh wow, I gotta try that. So that's all I got for this episode. Come on back next time and we'll talk about another one.